Lesson 59. The genitive and ablative of description. Causal clauses. Caesar, Book 1, Chapter 6, concluded. Hi everybody, welcome back to Lenny's Latin class. Today we're on page 176, and we're going to talk about a couple of miscellaneous grammar items, some of which will be review. Let's jump into section 463, and we'll talk about the genitive of description and ablative of description. Let's read the paragraph below the model sentences at the bottom of page 176. Let's read that together. In these illustrations, the genitive or ablative is used to describe. The two cases are generally used in this way without any distinction, except that size, weight, and number are expressed by the genitive only. Either case must be modified by an adjective. These constructions are called the genitive and ablative of description. In model sentence number 1, we see that the genitive of description really is not all that different from how we might say something in English. We have vir magnae auctoritatis. Vir is a second declension masculine noun that means man. And in this case, vir means man like a male, not man as in just a human being like the word homo would. Homo hominis from the third declension means man in the sense of a human being. It just means a person. But vir actually means a man like, a male, not female. And so for a woman, you have words like femina from the first declension and also mulier from the third declension. So homo hominis means like a person or a human being. Vir means a man, as in a male. Femina and mulier mean woman. So here we're talking about an actual man. So vir, and then we have two words in the genitive. Auctoritatis, that's the third declension noun auctoritas. It's feminine, and so it's being modified by magnae, which is also genitive singular. Auctoritas can mean several different things. Because the third declension noun auctoritas looks like our English word authority, sometimes students have a tendency to want to translate it as the word authority. But generally speaking, it's good to figure out some other way to translate it because it doesn't really map onto the word authority as well as you might think. I'll let you study that word on your own. You can consult a dictionary such as Lewis and Short. Here they're translating it as influence. So vir magnae auctoritatis says literally a man of great influence. The genitive that's being used here, that flavor of genitive, we call that the genitive of description. In number 2, we'll see the genitive used to express a distance, or in this case, a depth. Fossa trium pedum. Fossa means ditch. Pedum is the third declension noun pedis, which means foot, like the foot that you put your shoe on, that kind of foot. But it also means foot in the sense of a unit of measurement. Pedum is genitive plural. Again, the nominative singular is pes, P-E-S, and the genitive singular is pedis, so the genitive stem is P-E-D. If this noun were, by chance, an I stem, the genitive plural would be pedium, but it's not, so we just get pedum for our genitive plural. And then for the number 3, that's tres tria, we have trium as our genitive plural form. It's the same for all 3 genders, trium, 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 in the genitive plural. So trium pedum means of 3 feet. By the way, there are no singular forms of the number 3 because, 3 is inherently plural. If you have 3 of something, that's plural. So number 2 says a ditch of 3 feet in the sense of a ditch of 3 feet in depth. So it's expressing a distance in the sense of a depth. Remember, we just read below on line 3 of that paragraph, it says, size, weight, and number are expressed by the genitive only. So that's what we have here in number 2, the genitive of description showing a size, weight, or depth. In number 3, we have an ablative of description. The wir is back again. The wir from number 1, that means man. And then bono is the adjective bonus bona bonum, which means good. And animo is the second declension noun animus. You know, in Latin, we have the first declension noun anima and the second declension noun animus. So there are 2 words that are etymologically similar. The first declension noun anima in Latin can mean things like air or breeze, just like the Greek word psyche. It means, air, or it can mean soul or spirit or life, or it can mean breath. Very similar to the Greek words psyche or pneuma. It's got that semantic range of meaning air and breath, but also soul or spirit. So that's the first declension noun anima. The second declension noun animus, that can also mean things like life or soul, but it has more of the feeling of being about someone's mind. Here in exercise 3, or should I say model sentence 3, they're translating it as disposition. So the second declension noun animus has more of a personality or emotion sort of meaning. So it can mean things like mind, emotion, reason, motivation. It's kind of the intellectual side of things. So sometimes you'll see it translated as mind. So first declension anima can mean breath, air, or soul. Second declension animus can mean things more like mind or emotional motivation, disposition. That's the difference between anima and animus. So here, bono animo, both of those are ablative singular. It's saying good animus in the sense of good mind, good disposition, perhaps good temperament would be a nice way to translate it. And since it's ablative of description, we'll use that as a way to describe the wir. So we can use the English word with and say a man with good disposition, or we can use the word of, man of good disposition. To make a long story short, this is an ablative of description, and those words are intended to describe the wir. That's really all we're talking about here. Moving on to number 4, we have yet another ablative of description. We're talking about the Gallic tribe known as the Boii. We were talking about the Boii a little bit in recent lessons. Remember that the Helvetii wanted to get the Boii to come along with them on their mass exodus. They were inviting several other tribes just to their north, but also this tribe called the Boii, which apparently is a little bit further east. So Boii says, the people of the Boii tribe, and then Erant says they were. So far, the Boii were. Now we have an ablative of description, magna virtute. Here we have the third declension noun, virtus. Genitive singular is virtutus, so the genitive stem is virtut. And to make it ablative singular, we add the letter E to the genitive stem, and we get virtute. And it means something like valor, bravery in battle, that kind of valor. It's grammatically feminine, so we need the feminine noun magna to modify it. So magna virtute is ablative singular, and it says great valor. But since it's ablative of description, we need to translate it in such a way that it describes the Boii. So we can throw in the word with, throw in the word of, and we get the Boii were of great valor. And as you can see in the translation, you can throw in the word men or people if you want and say the Boii were men of great valor. The Boii were people of great valor. That's section 463. It's really not too difficult. You just have to get the feeling of how these genitives and ablatives can describe something. Moving on to the top of page 177, we have a rule here in section 464. We just now covered it. The genitive or ablative with an adjective in agreement is used to describe a noun. That's called the genitive of description or the ablative of description. Let's move on now to section 465, causal clauses. It says that they are clauses that express cause or reason. They are adverbial and may begin with these words: quod, quoniam, quia, quando, and then in number 2 it says cum. And, of course, we've talked extensively about cum clauses. Cum plus the subjunctive can mean under the circumstances that, since, or although. And so here we have a cum causal kind of clause being mentioned in number 2, section 2 of section 465. But in section 1, we've got words like quod or quoniam. I think that in Caesar's Gallic Wars, we're primarily going to see the word quod doing this kind of work. So in this kind of context, quod means because. Let's take a look at the example sentence here. Helvetii reliquos Gallos virtute praecedunt, quod cum Germanis contindunt. This isn't really new. We've covered this kind of sentence before. So the subject is Helvetii, and praecedunt means to excel or surpass. So the Helvetii surpass or excel reliquos Gallos, the other Gauls. Virtute is an ablative of respect, with respect to valor or in valor. So the Helvetii surpass the other Gauls in valor. Why? The second part of the sentence tells us. Quod cum Germanis contindunt. Quod means because, cum Germanis means with the Germans, and contindunt is the verb contendo. That means strive, fight, or hasten. So they struggle with the Germans or they fight with the Germans. So the idea is that all that fighting they do with the Germans toughens them up and makes them tough in battle and courageous in battle. Remember that the Helvetii live right next to the Rhine River, so probably they are geographically close to some German tribes, and that's probably why they're fighting with Germans. So this example sentence says, the Helvetii surpass other Gauls with respect to valor because they fight with the Germans. And here's the interesting new thing that I'd like to mention. Well, they mention it here. They say in number 1, they say quod or quoniam, because or since. The verb is in the indicative, or if the reason is quoted, the subjunctive. It's explained a little better in Allen and Greenough. Again, Dickinson University has a wonderful online version of Allen and Greenough, dickinson.edu. That's their website. It's wonderfully formatted and easy to read, a great resource. So I would recommend, as you get more advanced in your Latin skills, do some extra supplementary reading on your own to help develop your skills. And that's a good way to do it, by reading Allen and Greenough. For only a few dollars, you can get yourself a hard copy of Allen and Greenough, or you can use the online version at Dickinson University, or Dickinson College, that is. Another good textbook is Moreland and Fleischer. It's called Latin, an Intensive Course. by Floyd Moreland and Rita Fleischer. And if you're looking for even more explanations, another really good book is called A New Latin Syntax by Woodcock. That textbook is interesting because it's not laid out like a typical textbook. Instead, it's organized by case. He goes through and explains each case and all the different things that case can do. So that's also some really good supplementary reading for you if you're looking to improve your knowledge. Of course, any Latin textbook is going to be good. If you go through a Latin textbook of any kind and read the grammar and do the exercises, you'll improve. And in fact, that's a good thing to do. Whenever you're learning any language, you need lots and lots of repetition. But I'm just pointing you towards some good resources that can help you to advance your knowledge and get more of a detailed knowledge of the grammar, which can be good for reading texts, as we're doing here. So anyway, back to causal clauses for a moment. Here's what it says in Allen and Greenough in section 540. It says, the causal particles, quod and quia, take the indicative when the reason is given on the authority of the writer or speaker, the subjunctive when the reason is given on the authority of another. So if you are a Latin author, a Latin writer, and you are writing history, and you want to say why something happened, and you say quod, because, if you say that that thing happened, and you explain why it's happening because of knowledge that you yourself know, you'll put the verb in the indicative. As we see here in section 1, quod cum Germanis contindunt. Contindunt there is indicative. That suggests that Julius Caesar knows that for himself. He knows, just from his own knowledge and experience, that the Helvetii fight with the Germans. But if he were quoting that from someone else, if he were getting that information from somebody else, he would put the verb contindunt in the subjunctive. So the part of the sentence that says quod cum Germanis contindunt, if the writer knows that, and it's that writer's own knowledge, he or she will put it in the indicative. If that writer is getting it from some other source, the verb will go in the subjunctive. So here, if Caesar were getting that information from somebody else about the Helvetii fighting with the Germans, if he were getting that from someone else, he would make it contendant, C-O-N-T-E-N-D-A-N-T. And so the verb for fighting, contendo, that would be subjunctive. So that's kind of the new interesting thing we're learning here, is if you're making a causal clause, the source of the information affects the way you render it into Latin. It affects whether you make the verb indicative or subjunctive. Kind of an interesting thing, I think. Moving on to section 2 of section 465, we have cum, which means since or because. And this we've already talked about many times. That's just a cum clause. We call it a cum causal clause. And we have an example sentence here. His cum persuadere non possunt, legatos ad domnorigem mittunt. So the main clause is legatos ad domnorigem mittunt. They send envoys or ambassadors to Dumnorix. And then the cum clause at the beginning of the sentence, that tells us the reason why. We'll translate cum as since or because. Possunt is imperfect subjunctive. So we'll say because they were not able, and we have the complementary infinitive persuadere, because they were not able to persuade. And then, of course, persuadeo takes the dative. So his, that's the group of people being persuaded, or in this case, not being persuaded. His, of course, is a form of hic haec hoc, which means this. And here it's a pronoun, so it means these guys, these people, In the translation, they translate it as them, which is okay, I guess, but technically it's these people. So since they were not able to persuade these people, they send ambassadors to Dumnorix. So in that particular kind of causal clause, the verb is always going to be subjunctive. There's no such thing as a cum causal clause with an indicative verb. That's not a thing. Cum plus an indicative, that's what you call a cum temporal clause, and that talks about timing. So cum plus the subjunctive, that's either circumstantial, causal, or concessive. Circumstantial tells the circumstances under which something happens. Causal is what we have here. It tells the reason for something. And concessive is the kind of statement that says, although something happened, blah, blah, blah. It's got a feeling of although. Quick review of cum clauses. We have cum circumstantial, we have cum causal, which is what we have here, and cum concessive. So 3 different kinds of cum clause with a subjunctive verb, and then 1 kind of cum clause that takes an indicative verb, and that's the cum temporal. So here we have just a garden variety cum causal clause, which we've already covered. So really this is just review. Moving on to section 466, we have the irregular noun vis. This is kind of a strange word, and I've heard it explained in different ways, actually. When it's plural, it's supposed to mean something like strength, but then when it's singular, it's supposed to mean something like force or violence. So whether it's singular or plural affects its meaning. In English, we have the expression vim and vigor, which is supposed to be energy or vitality, something like that. And vim is, of course, the accusative singular form of this word. This is a third declension noun, but as I mentioned, it's really irregular. So the nominative singular form is vis, and also the genitive singular vis. Dative singular we, with a long I. Whim is accusative singular. We, again, vi, that's ablative singular. Apparently, it declines as an I stem. So vires in the nominative plural, virium in the genitive plural, viribus for dative and ablative plural, and then again vires for accusative plural. So basically, in the singular, it's supposed to mean things like force, power, violence. It can even mean like assaulting someone. And in the plural, it's supposed to mean something like physical strength. Like if you have a strong body and you have physical strength, that's what it's supposed to mean when it's plural. Let's move on now to section 467. That's our translation section for this lesson. Go ahead and do all the exercises here, and as you do, keep an eye out for the genitive of description and the ablative of description. So go ahead and turn the recording off, and when you're ready, turn it back on, and we'll go over them together. Okay, hopefully by now you've completed your exercises here in section 467. Let's go over them together, starting with number 1. Acies legionum quatuor. Here we have a genitive of description. Acies means army, and then we have the genitive plural, legionum, which means of legions, and then quatuor is modifying legionum. Remember that quatuor is an indeclinable number, so you don't have different forms of it. You don't have quatorium for genitive plural, or quatuora when it's feminine and quatorus when it's masculine. You don't have that. It's just always quatuor because it's indeclinable. So, even though it's genitive plural here and it's modifying legionum, it's still just quatuor. So you just have to mentally accept the fact that quatuor is genitive plural along with legionum. So number 1 says, an army of 4 legions, in the sense that it's an army comprised of 4 legions. Again, that's a genitive of description. Quick review of the word achies. We mentioned before that an achies is an army more in the sense of formed up on the battlefield in a battle formation. There's another word, the word agmen, A-G-M-E-N. An agmen is an army in the sense of in a marching formation, like in a big block or a big line, marching along on a road, like a marching formation. So achies and agmen both mean army, but they have a different connotation. Moving on to number 2, Dumnorix erat summa audacia. Here we have an ablative of description. The authors of the book are giving us lots of ablatives of description and genitives of description in our exercises for practice because they introduced that in this lesson. So here in number 2, it's an ablative of description. Dumnorix is one of the aristocrats, one of the high-ranking aristocrats of the Haidui tribe. So that's a person's name. Erat means he was. And then summa and audacia, well, that's the ablative of description. Audacia is a noun that means boldness. We have related English words like audacious. And then summa, that's a superlative adjective. It means highest. So number 2 says, Dumnorix was of the highest boldness. Number 3 is next. Homines erunt inimico animo. Here we have another ablative of description. That's inimico animo. The word homines means people, and then erunt is a future tense verb of being, which means they will be. So we could say, the people will be, or we could say, there will be people, or we could say, they will be people. Any of those would work. We just have to figure out which one is the smoothest and communicates the sense of what the Latin is saying. And then inimico animo, again, that's the ablative of description. Animo is a noun. That's the second declension noun animus, which means something like mind, perhaps mindset, disposition, not to be confused with the first declension noun anima, which means things like wind or spirit. So you've got first declension anima and second declension animus with different meanings. So here we have animus, which is more like intellect, mind, mindset, disposition. And inimico, that's the first and second declension adjective, inimicus, which means unfriendly. We have related English words like enemy and inimical. So this sentence says something like, they will be people with an unfriendly disposition, or they will be people of an unfriendly disposition. Again, that's an ablative of description. Number 4 is next. Per facile est totius Galliae potiri, cum helvetii virtute omnibus praestent. We have 2 clauses here, a main clause starting with per facile, and then a cum clause starting with the word cum. Notice that we have a subjunctive verb in the cum clause. That means it will be either circumstantial, causal, or concessive. In our main clause, we have sort of an impersonal kind of statement being made here. Per facile means very easy. Of course, facile means easy, and then per, prefixed to it, is an intensifying prefix. It means something like very. So per and facile together, very easy. And est means something like it is in an impersonal sense. So per facile est says something like it is very easy. Or if you want to be more technical about it and really analyze it, you could say that totius Galliae potiri, really, that's a noun clause that forms the subject of the sentence. And then est is the verb. And then per facile is a predicate adjective modifying that noun clause. So if you really want to get technical, that's what's happening here. But from a translation perspective, we'll just start out by saying something like, it is very easy. By the way, notice that per facile is neuter. That's a third declension neuter adjective. Why is it neuter? Put on your thinking cap and think about it a minute. Why is per facile neuter? The answer is that potiri, as an infinitive, really potiri is the subject if you want to get right down to it. The idea is potiri means to take possession of, right? That's the verb potior. So potiri, to take possession of, is. That's really the core of the sentence. So really what we have is an infinitive acting as a noun, being the subject of the sentence. And when that happens, that infinitive, grammatically speaking, as far as gender goes, is grammatically neuter. So for per facile to modify it as a predicate adjective, it needs to match it in gender. So potiri, as an infinitive, is grammatically neuter. Per facile is neuter because it needs to agree with potiri. Little clues like that can reveal something about the Latin language, that they viewed an infinitive like that as grammatically neuter. It's kind of interesting, I think. So again, potior as a verb, that's one of the puffy verbs, or puff-v verbs, one of those 5 deponent verbs that takes the ablative potior, utor, fruor, fungor, and vescor. Puff-v verbs. Puff-v is an acronym that helps you remember them. And potiri, seeing as how it is a puffy verb, it takes the ablative, but it can also take the genitive. I've been told that potiri can take the genitive when it has to do with overthrowing governments and taking over countries and taking over governments. And that's what we have here. We have the idea of taking possession of Galliae. Galliae is genitive, and so we have potiri taking the genitive. Even though it's a puffy verb, it can still take the genitive sometimes. And then totius, that's one of our naughty 9 adjectives. That's the adjective totus, tota, totum, which means all of something in the sense of one complete whole unit. The adjective omnis also means all, but I think it has a different shade of meaning. It has more to do with the amount of something, and it can also mean every. But totus, tota, totum has to do with all of one big unit. So again, it's a naughty 9 adjective. So in the genitive singular, we're going to have ius. So totius, as we see here, is genitive singular. So totius Galliae says, of all Gaul. Since totius is a naughty 9 adjective, it's the same in the masculine and feminine. So even though Galliae is feminine, we still have totius. Technically speaking, potiri, totius Galliae. That's a noun clause. That is the subject of the sentence. To take possession of all Gaul is very easy. That's really what the sentence is saying. To put it in smoother English, we could treat est as an impersonal and say, it is very easy to take possession of all Gaul. Next, we have a cum clause going from cum to the end of the sentence. This isn't really too hard, and we've also read lots of things like it, so I'll go a little quicker here. The verb is preisto. That means literally to stand in front of. So if you're standing in front of other people, you have surpassed them or exceeded them. Praestent is present tense subjunctive, third person plural, and it means they surpass. The subject is helvetii, and then virtute is an ablative of respect. They surpass with respect to valor or in valor. And who do they surpass? Omnibus. They surpass everybody. And so why is omnibus dative plural? Why is it that when you say they surpass everybody, Why do you put the everybody in the dative? Well, that's because praestent is a compound verb. The story with many compound verbs is that they're intransitive. So it's not like English where we say someone surpasses someone and the someone being surpassed is a direct object. Here it's more like they stand in front with relation to everybody. In the Latin, it's not exactly like a transitive verb with a direct object. It's more of they stand in front of everyone. Hopefully you can see how that's not so much of a direct object kind of structure. To make a long story short, praestent is a compound verb. Omnibus is dative with compound verbs. So this cum clause says the Helvetii surpass everybody in valor. Our final task is to figure out what cum means. Is it causal, concessive? Is it circumstantial? Just for practice, let's try each one and see what happens. It is very easy to take possession of all of Gaul under the circumstances that the Helvetii surpass everyone in valor. That doesn't really work so well. It kind of makes sense, but not exactly. Let's try concessive, just for practice. It is very easy to take possession of all Gaul, although the Helvetii surpass everyone in valor. That doesn't make sense because it makes it sound like the Helvetii surpassing everyone in valor is somehow contrary to the idea of taking over Gaul. So it's really the opposite of what's being expressed or what is supposed to be expressed here. Finally, let's try cum causal and see if that makes sense. It is very easy to take possession of all Gaul because the Helvetii surpass everyone in valor. Now that makes perfect sense because it's telling us a reason why. It's easy to take possession of Gaul because the Helvetii are great warriors. So that makes perfect sense. And so what that means is that the cum clause here is a cum causal clause. So the entire sentence says, to take possession of all Gaul is very easy. Or, it is very easy to take possession of all Gaul because the Helvetii surpass everyone in valor. Number 5 is next. Haedui cum se ab eis defendere non possent, legatos ad Caesarem miserunt. Here we have a main clause, and then in the middle of the sentence, a cum clause with a subjunctive verb. That means it will be either cum circumstantial, cum causal, or cum concessive. Which one will it be? We'll find out. But the main sentence is Haedui legatos ad Caesarem miserunt. The subject is Haedui. That's a tribe in Gaul who used to be allies of the Romans. Miserunt is the verb mitto, which means to send. This is third person plural, perfect tense. So it says they sent. Legatos means ambassadors or envoys. Ad Caesarem says to Caesar. So the main clause here, the main sentence is the Haedui sent envoys to Caesar. So the cum clause is going to do a little extra explanation of what's happening here. Again, it'll be either circumstantial, causal, or concessive. We know it won't be temporal because when you have a cum temporal clause, cum takes an indicative verb. But here we have possent, which is subjunctive. So non possent says they were not able. That's imperfect subjunctive. We have a complementary infinitive, that's defendere. Defendere means to defend. And then the direct object is se, which is a reflexive pronoun. That means themselves. So the Haedui were not able to defend themselves. Ab eis says from those people or from them. The context here is that the Haedui had invited a German warlord named Ariovistus to come in. Basically, they hired him to do mercenary work, to come in and help them defeat their enemies. But Ariovistus, after he came in from Germany, he started to take over the Haidui tribe. So the plan backfired, and the Haidui were having a serious case of what you might call buyer's remorse. So ab eis here is probably referring to Ariovistus's troops. So the Haidui are being harassed and oppressed by Ariovistus and his mercenary troops. They ask for help from Julius Caesar, and that's the context here. So the Haidui non possunt defendere. They were not able to defend, se, themselves, ab eis, from them, referring to Ariovistus and his mercenary troops. So, is this clause circumstantial, causal, or concessive? It's a cum clause with a subjunctive verb, so it's going to have to be one of those three. Let's try each one just for learning and see which one it is. Let's try concessive first. So we'll translate cum as although, and we'll say this. The Haidui, although they were not able to defend themselves from them, they sent envoys to Caesar. That doesn't really make sense because it makes it sound like the thing in the cum clause is somehow working against the thing in the main clause, like they're somehow at odds with each other. But that's not the feeling we get. The feeling we get is they send envoys to Caesar to ask him for help. So saying although they weren't able to defend themselves, that doesn't really fit the context. What if it's circumstantial? What if we say the Haidui, under the circumstances that they were not able to defend themselves from them, they sent envoys to Caesar? Well, that's not too bad. It actually kind of makes sense. Now let's try a cum causal translation and see what happens. The Haidui, since they were not able to defend themselves from them, they sent envoys to Caesar. Now this makes perfect sense. It tells you why they sent the envoys. Why did they send envoys to Caesar? Because they were not able to defend themselves from them. Them meaning Ariovistus and his German mercenaries. So, analytically speaking, the cum clause here is a cum causal clause, and the whole sentence as a whole says, the Haidui, since they were not able to defend themselves from them, sent envoys to Caesar. Number 6 is next. Iter per provinciam faciemus, propterea quod, aliud iter habemus nullum. Here we have a main clause and then a causal clause. The main clause is iter per provinciam faciemus. We don't have an explicitly stated subject because the subject is we. That's faciemus, a form of the verb facio, which means do or make. This is future tense, first person plural. So it's we will make or we will do. And the direct object is iter, a neuter noun of the third declension. That means road, journey, way, march, route, things like that. So the subject, verb, and direct object will be, we will make a march, or we will do a march. Per provinciam means through the province. That means the Roman province in the south of Gaul, known as Provincia or Gallia Narbonensis. So we will make a march through the province, or we could simply just say, we will march through the province. We don't have to translate iter and faciemus separately or literally like that. Propterea means on account of, and then quod means that. Together they say something like, on account of the fact that. That's really a pretty good way to translate it. It communicates what it's saying there in the Latin. Habemus is the verb habeo, which means to have. And here it's present tense, first person plural. So it's we have. So again, the subject within this causal clause is we. So what we have so far would say, we will march through the province on account of the fact that we have. And what do we have? Iter. That's the same noun as we saw before. Road, march, way, journey, route. And it's being modified by aliud. Aliud is a naughty nine adjective, and it means other or another. So it's a first and second declension adjective. Again, that's a naughty nine adjective. So it's alias, alia, aliud. Aliud is neuter because it's modifying the neuter noun iter. So aliud and iter together say other route or perhaps another route. That's the second naughty nine adjective we've seen recently. In exercise 4, we saw totius. That's totus, tota, totum. Notice that in the genitive singular, the masculine, feminine, and neuter forms are all the same. That's one of the characteristics that sets apart the naughty nine adjectives, is the ius ending in the genitive singular. The other characteristic is the letter I, that is the ending in the dative singular. So the genitive singular and dative singular, those are the endings that set apart the naughty nine adjectives from other adjectives. Okay, so habemus and then aliud iter, those words say we have another route, and then we have nullum, which is yet another naughty nine adjective. That's nullus, nulla, nullum. In the genitive singular, it would be nullius. In the dative singular, it would be nulli, with a long I ending. And again, these genitive and dative singular forms are the same for all three genders. So for a masculine dative singular, you might expect nullo with a long O, but no, you get a long I. And in the genitive singular, masculine, you might expect nulli, but no, you get nullius. So the ius for all three genders in the genitive singular, and the long I ending in the dative singular for all three genders, those are the main characteristics that set apart the naughty nine adjectives from other adjectives. That's why they're called naughty, is because those two particular endings, dative singular and genitive singular, they don't behave themselves very well, like a well-behaved adjective should. So in number 4, we had totius, and here in number 6, we have aliud and nullum. All three of those are naughty nine adjectives. So that naughty nine adjective pattern is definitely worthy of your review. Back to our exercise, we have habemus, which means we have. Aliud iter means other route or other way. And then nullum means no or none or not any. And that's also modifying iter. So really what it's saying is we have no other route, or we have no other way. Somewhat similar to how we might express it in English. Like in English, we say, we have no other choice, or there is no other way. So it's really similar to English idiom. So number 6 altogether says, we will march through the province on account of the fact that we have no other route. The context there would be a member of the Helvetii tribe talking about what routes are available. Number 7 is next. Allobrogibus persuadebunt, quod sunt nondum bono animo in populum Romanum. Again, we have a main clause and then a causal clause. The main clause is allobrogibus persuadebunt. Most of the Gallic tribes that we've encountered have names from the first or second declensions, but the Allobroges have a third declension name. So instead of Allobrogi, it's Allobroges, and I'm pretty sure the accent is on the antepenult. So it's Allobroges, not Allobroges. because the O there is not long. It's apparently a short I. And persuadebunt means they will persuade. That's future tense, the verb persuadeo. And so allobrogibus is dative plural. That's the party here being persuaded. Of course, persuadeo takes the dative. So it says here, they will persuade the allobroges. Now we have a causal clause starting with quod, which we can translate as because. Okay, so quod means because, sunt means they are, nondum means not yet. And then we have an ablative of description, bono animo. That means with a good mind, with a good disposition, of a good disposition, of a good attitude, perhaps. It's the ablative case used in such a way as to describe someone or something. We might translate bono animo as with a good disposition. Finally, we have in populum Romanum. Ordinarily, when in takes the accusative, it means things like into or perhaps against. Here it means something more like toward. So number 7 altogether says, they will persuade the allobroges because they are not yet of a good disposition toward the Roman people. Number 8 is next. Existemant se allobrogibus persuasuros esse, quod sint nondum bono, and we have a page turn here in the middle of the exercise, quod sint nondum bono animo. Again, we have a main clause and then a causal clause. Our main clause is existemant se allobrogibus persuasuros esse. This is a classic case of indirect speech. Existemant means they think in the sense of they suppose. That's present tense, third person plural. The they being referred to here is the helvetii. We have no explicitly stated subject, but that's who it's talking about. So they think that, and now we go into indirect speech. The subject accusative is se. Here, se is plural. Se can be singular or plural. So that's the subject accusative of the indirect statement. And then we have persuasuros esse. That's a future active infinitive. Persuasuros and esse are working together. Literally, it's they think that they are about to persuade. Persuasuros is a future active participle of the verb persuadeo. It's accusative plural masculine because it is modifying se. It's what you call a predicate accusative. It's just like in a regular sentence if you have a predicate nominative. But in indirect speech, the subject is accusative. You have a subject accusative. So later, if you have a predicate adjective modifying it, that also has to be accusative. And so we call it a predicate accusative. So literally, they think that they are about to persuade the allobroges. Again, allobroges needs to be in the dative plural because persuadeo takes the dative, and they're the ones being persuaded. So they think that they are about to persuade the allobroges. So that's a very wooden, literal translation. It's really better if we take persuasuros and esse together as one thought or idea and just translate it as a general sounding future tense verb. And we can use the word will and say, they think that they will persuade the allobroges. If you want to be even more literal, you could say this. They think themselves to be about to persuade the allobroges. That's really how the indirect speech breaks down. They think themselves to be about to, blah, blah, blah. But it's better to take persuasuros esse as one sense unit, as a future tense infinitive, and just say, they think that they will persuade the allobroges. Next, we have a causal clause starting with quod, we can translate quote as because. Sint means they are. That's the same as sunt, except it's subjunctive. More on that in a moment. Nondum means not yet. Bono animo is an ablative of description. It means with a good attitude, with a good disposition, of a good disposition. Any of those things will work. So altogether it says, they think that they will persuade the allobroges because they are, they referring to the allobroges, because they are not yet of a good disposition. Now, why is sint subjunctive? Remember that the authors of the book told us that in a causal clause, if the information being provided there is based on the author's own knowledge, then the verb goes in the indicative. But if the author is getting it from someplace else, like quoting it or getting it from someone else's authority, then the verb goes into the subjunctive mood. And so that's about the best I can do to explain why sint here is subjunctive. So number 8 says, they think that they will persuade the allobroges because they, meaning the allobroges, are not yet of a good disposition. Number 9 is next. Caesar dixit se haduos defensurum, quoniam Ariovistus bellum eis intulicet. Again, here we have a main clause and then a causal clause. The main clause is Caesar through defensurum. And again, this is a classic case of indirect speech. The subject is Caesar, and then dixit means he said. That's third person singular. Perfect tense from the verb dico, which means to say. So Caesar dixit means Caesar said. Now we have indirect speech. In any indirect statement, you need a subject accusative and then an infinitive to be the verb. So here, say is the subject accusative. It's a reflexive pronoun referring back to Caesar. So Caesar said that he. Now we need an infinitive to be the verb. What's the infinitive here? Well, sometimes when you're reading a Latin text and you see indirect speech, and the verb needs to be an infinitive, and the verb is supposed to be some kind of participle plus esse, and those two words are working together to form some kind of infinitive, participle plus esse. Sometimes they will just leave out the word esse, and the word esse is understood or implied. And that's what's happening here. Defensurum is a future active participle of the verb defendo, which means defend. So defensurum means about to defend. This is an example of a future active infinitive with defensurum plus esse, but the word esse has been left out. You could call it a suppressed esse. You could call it an understood esse, whatever you want. But you have to think of the word esse as being present there. You might say that you have to supply it or that it's understood. If you want, feel free to get out a pen or pencil and just write a tiny esse right there next to defensurum. So what that gives us is defensurum esse, which is a future active infinitive. Defensurum is a participle, so it needs to agree with se. That's why it's accusative, and that's why it's masculine. It's matching the case, number, and gender of se. So what we have so far would say this. Caesar said that he was about to defend, and then haiduos is the direct object. That's the Haidui tribe. In indirect speech, the tense of the infinitive verb is relative to the tense of the main verb. Here, dixit is perfect tense. That's a past tense verb. So the understood esse here in the indirect speech, we're going to put that into the past tense along with dixit. So we'll translate it as was, and we'll say, Caesar said that he was about to defend the Haidui. Again, that's a very wooden, literal translation. To put it into smoother English, we might say this: Caesar said that he was going to defend the Haidui, or Caesar said that he would defend the Haidui. Either one of those is fine. It communicates the idea that Caesar said that in the future he would defend the Haidui. If you say Caesar said that he was about to defend the Haidui, it makes it sound like any minute now he's going to rush out and defend the Haidui, as if the action is imminent at that moment. I don't think that's really what's being communicated here. I think it's simply saying Caesar said that he would at some point in the future defend the Haidui, as if he's telling you his general plans, not that he's about to do it at that very moment. So a nice smooth English translation would be, Caesar said that he will defend the Haidui. Caesar said that he would defend the Haidui. Caesar said that he was going to defend the Haidui. Something like that. Next we have quoniam, which means because or since. And here we have a subjunctive verb, into licet. Remember the verb pharaoh? Here we have a compounded form of pharaoh. It's a in plus pharaoh, which means to bring upon. Remember the four principal parts of pharaoh: pharaoh, phare, tuli, latum. So this is pluperfect subjunctive. It's telling us about something that is even before the time scheme of the main verb. The main verb is dixit. That's just perfect tense, saying something that happened in the past. But with the pluperfect subjunctive, we're going even one notch further back into the past to talk about some kind of activity that happened even before Caesar said something about defending the Haidui. So if Caesar said he would defend the Haidui on Wednesday, then maybe a couple of days before that, the activity in this causal clause had already happened. So it's pluperfect, taking us even one notch back into the past. The subject is ariovistus, and again, into licet is a pluperfect subjunctive, and we'll say ariovistus had brought upon. And what did he bring upon? He brought war. That's bellum. And then eis means them. That's dative plural. And those are the people upon whom war is being brought. So the causal clause says, because or since ariovistus had brought war upon them. You can think of eis as being dative with compound verbs because it's in pharaoh. Or you can think about it as being an indirect object, being the party that's receiving or benefiting. Either way, eis needs to be dative. And so number 9 altogether says, Caesar said that he would defend the Haidui since ariovistus had brought war upon them. In these next few exercises, we don't have complete sentences. We just have fragments for practice. So let's take a look at 10, 11, and 12. In number 10, we just have viribus. That's a form of the irregular noun vis. We talked about vis in section 466 above. The basic idea is that in the singular, it means things like force or violence, but in the plural, it has to do with strength, like bodily strength. It's the kind of noun that, even though it's plural, you translate it in a singular kind of way. So viribus, if that's ablative, it could be an ablative of means, and it could say, by means of strength. Ablative plural. Again, it's not part of a sentence, so we don't really have any context to use to try to translate it any better than that. It's just an exercise for practice. It's ablative plural, and therefore could mean by means of strength. Number 11 is next. Vis fluminis. Here we have vis, and then it's fluminis, of the river. Fluminis is genitive. And so vis is nominative singular. And so it could be saying something like the force of the river or the violence of the river. So you can see the difference in meaning there between 10 and 11. In the plural, it's more like strength. In the singular, it's more like violent force. Number 12 is next. Vim facere conantur. The verb here is conantur. That's the verb conor, which means try or attempt, and it's third person plural present tense. So conantur says they are trying. There's a footnote down below, footnote 1. It says to translate facere as to use. So conantur and facere, ordinarily it would say they are trying to do or they are trying to make. That's how you would translate it literally. And then vim being singular, we could translate it as violence or force. So literally, they are trying to do force, they are trying to do violence, they are trying to make force, they are trying to make violence. That's literally what it says. But for smoother English, let's do what the footnote says, and let's translate facere as to use. So number 12 says, they are trying to use force. Number 13, eos we cogent. The verb here is cogent. That's a form of the verb cogo. That's a compound verb. Really, it's co or con plus ago. Ago is very similar to our English word do. Ago can mean do, make, drive, perform. It can mean lots of things. It's very versatile, just like our English verb do. And so with the prefix con, the N drops out, the A in ago drops out, and so con ago turns into co-go. And it can mean to collect, like to bring together, or it can mean to force someone to do something or to compel someone to do something. Before, in other texts, earlier in this textbook, we've seen kogo mean collect or gather. In this particular exercise, it means to compel or force. So this verb here, cogent, is actually future tense. If it were present tense, it would be cogunt. So cogent is future. It means they will compel or they will force. And then the direct object is eos. That's a form of issa id. It's accusative plural masculine. We can translate it as them. So they will compel them. And then we is ablative. It's a singular form of vis, so we can translate it as force or violence. So number 13 says, they will compel them by means of violence, or they will compel them by means of force. Or for an even smoother translation, you could say, they will compel them by force. Let's go on ahead now to section 469. That's our Caesar reading for today. It's the last part of chapter 6 of book 1. And this passage continues directly from what came before it. In our last Caesar reading, we were learning about the two different roads that were available to the Helvetii. And at the very end of it, Caesar mentions that in some places you can ford the river. That is, it's shallow enough in some places that you can wade across. And then finally, he mentions the town of Geneva, which in Latin is Genawa. So here, at the beginning of this reading, the first sentence talks about a town. The third word is opido. And so that town being referred to is Geneva, which, in the last reading, Caesar told us is the farthest town of the Allobroges and the nearest to the territory of the Helvetii. So it's really right there on the border. The Rhone River and Lake Geneva, they form the boundary between Gallia Narbonensis, or Provincia, and the territory of the Helvetii. So that's the international border, you might say. So we pick up here in section 469, and we're talking about the area near Geneva. So let's read the first sentence here. It says, ex eo opido pons ad Helvetios pertinet. The subject here is pons, and that means bridge, and pertinet means extends. That's a form of the verb pertineo, which means to extend. And so pons and pertinet says a bridge extends. Ad Helvetios means to the Helvetii. And ex eo opido says from this town, referring to Geneva, which was mentioned in the previous sentence. That's the last sentence from our previous reading. Ex is a preposition that takes the ablative. It means out of. Eo is a form of is ea id. It can mean this, that, perhaps even the. So literally, out of this town, or out of the town, a bridge extends to the Helvetii. So let's think about this for a minute. This means that Geneva is on the south side of the Rhone, but there's a bridge that goes across the Rhone to the north side to where the Helvetii live. And again, if you go to the Lenny's Latin Class website and click on Study Helps, if you take a look at the second map, the one that's black and white, you can see that Geneva is right there on the border, very close, apparently, to the Rhone. And so, apparently, according to Caesar, there's a bridge there that extends from the area of Geneva across the river. Next sentence. Allobrogibus sese vel persuasuros quod nondum bono animo in populum Romanum viderentur existimabant. Let's stop there. Our verb here is existimabant. That's imperfect tense of the verb existimo, which means to think, as in suppose. And so our subject is not explicitly stated. It's just they. There is no separate word to be the subject. So existimabant says they were thinking, and the they is the Helvetii. So they, referring to the Helvetii, were thinking, and then we have indirect speech. Sese is the subject accusative. It's a reflexive pronoun referring back to the subject, which is they, the Helvetii. So they thought, or they were thinking, that they, and then we have persuasuros. That's a future tense, active participle. We need to supply the word esse, because along with an understood esse, it's going to form a future active infinitive. Why do we need to have a future active infinitive? Because we're in indirect speech, and we need the verb to be an infinitive. So they were thinking that they, persuasuros esse, that they would persuade. Literally, that they were about to persuade. But that's a little bit wooden, so we'll translate it as they would persuade. Persuadeo takes the dative, so allobrogibus is dative. So they were thinking that they would persuade the allobroges. Notice also the word well, that's vel. That word is a correlative, and we see it again on line 3. And so what this is going to mean is either or. The first well is going to mean either, and the second well is going to mean or. So the structure here is that the Helvetii thought that they would either persuade the allobroges or that they would do something else. So Julius Caesar is writing this sentence to tell us the two things that the Helvetii were considering, that they thought they would either do this or that they would do that. Well is a correlative, meaning either or. And we're in the first part, we're in the either part of the sentence. So what we have so far would say, they were thinking that they would either persuade the allobroges, and then the next well means or, and then we go into another sentence there, another clause. Now we need to deal with the part in parentheses. That's a causal clause starting with quod, which we can translate as because. And we have this word viderentur. That's a form of the verb video. Here's a quick review of the verb video. It's from the second conjugation, but it's irregular. So the four principal parts are video, videre, visi, visum. So in the present, future, imperfect, in those tenses, it's pretty much normal. So video, I see, vides, you see, videt, he, she, or it sees, videmus, videtis, vident. Future tense, videbo, I will see. But in the perfect tense, to say I saw, you would say vidi, V-I-D-I. And then you saw would be vidisti, and so on and so forth. And here's the thing with video. In the active, it means I see. But when it's passive, here's what happens. If you say videt, that's he, she, or it sees. But if you make it passive and it becomes videtur, now it means he, she, or it is seen. And so when someone is seen, that's like saying someone is perceived. So if I say Sheila is seen to be a nice person, I'm saying that she is perceived to be a nice person. She looks like a nice person. Or better yet, I can say she seems, S-E-E-M-S, she seems like a nice person. So the Latin verb video, when it's active, it means to see, but when it's passive, it often means to seem. So if I want to say Fred seems like a nice person, I would say Fred videtur, blah, blah, blah. If I want to say Sheila seems like a nice person, I would say Sheila videtur, blah, blah, blah. Literally, Fred is seen to be a nice person, or Sheila is seen to be a nice person. So this passive use of video is definitely something you should know about as a student of Latin. And that's what we have happening here in this particular passage of Caesar's Gallic Wars with the verb viderentur. That's a form of video. It's imperfect subjunctive, but not only that, it's passive. So this causal clause in parentheses here will say something like this. Because they were seen, in the sense of they seemed, and then nondum means not yet. Bono animo is an ablative of description, with a good attitude, of a good attitude, with a good disposition, of a good disposition, those kinds of things. Because they were seen, or because they seemed not yet of a good disposition in populum Romanum, toward the Roman people. Video in the active means see. Video in the passive means to be seen in the sense of being perceived or to seem. So viderentur here says they seemed. Okay, taking it from the top, they were thinking that they would either persuade the allobroges because they seemed not yet of a good disposition toward the Roman people, or blah, blah, blah. So the next part of the sentence is the or. We've already got the either part. It's an either-or construction. Remember that well, those two words are correlatives. So now we need to read the part that says, well, we coacturos ut per suos fines eos ire paterentur. We're still in indirect speech here. We're still working from the verb existimabant. We do not have an explicitly stated subject. We do not have an explicitly stated direct object. We need to reuse those things from the previous part of the sentence. The part of the sentence about persuading the allobroges. We need to translate this part of the sentence with those previous things in mind. Keep the same subject and direct object in mind from the first part of the sentence, and we're going to reuse that now. So existamabant is still in force. They were thinking that, blah, 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 indirect speech. And then coacturos is the verb here in this part of the sentence. Again, we need to supply the word esse here. So it's coacturos esse. Coacturos is a future active participle. Together with esse, it will form a future active infinitive. Whenever you have indirect speech, you need a subject accusative, and then you need an infinitive to be the verb. In this part of the sentence, the verb is coacturos esse. The subject accusative here is still sese. By the way, sese is just the same as the reflexive pronoun se. There's no difference between se and sese. It's just an alternate spelling. So we're reusing sese here as the subject accusative. So they were thinking that they would either persuade the allobroges or that coacturos esse, that they would compel them or force them. Coacturos esse is a form of the verb cogo, which is really the verb ago, which means do, with a prefix con. Okay, it's con plus ago. It can mean to collect, or it can mean to force or compel. Here it means to force or compel. And then we have we, that's vi, that's the ablative singular form of vis. That means by means of force or by means of violence. We can just translate it as by force. So the Helvetii were thinking that they would either persuade the allobroges or coacturos esse, or that they would force them by means of force. That's a little repetitive, so we can translate coacturos as compel. So let's say, or compel them by force. After we read about the compelling by force, we have an ut clause with a subjunctive verb. It has the structure of an indirect command. If we think of cogo as a verb of demanding or asking, it starts to look very similar to an indirect command. So the ut clause will tell us what they wanted to force them to do. We have the verb here, paterentur. That's the verb patior. Patior means to suffer, or it means to allow or permit. It's a deponent verb, so it's got a passive ending. It looks passive, but it's not really passive because it's deponent. The principal parts are patior, pati, passus sum. This is where we get our English word passion. So ut plus paterentur says that they permit or that they allow. The direct object of paterentur is eos. That's a form of isea id. It's accusative plural, masculine, and it's referring to the Helvetii. We can translate it as them. So backing up a little bit, or that they would compel them by force, that they permit them or allow them. And then we have the infinitive ire. Eos and ire together form a accusative plus infinitive kind of structure. So the idea is allow them to go. Ire is an infinitive form of the verb eo, which means go. Per suos fines means through their borders, or better yet, through their territory. And the suos refers to the allobroges. The idea is that the allobroges would permit the Helvetii to go through their territory, in other words, the territory of the allobroges. So we have pronouns like eos, adjectives like suos. Those don't really explicitly state who they're talking about. So as you translate, you really have to put on your thinking cap and keep in mind who these words are referring to. Because if you don't know who they're referring to, you won't be able to translate the sentence and get any kind of meaning out of it. So you have to know that eos refers to the Helvetii and that suos refers to the allobroges. Here's a good thing to remember about suos is that it always refers back to the subject of the sentence. It means his, her, its, or their, referring to the subject. In this part of the sentence, the verb is paterintur. They permit, or they would permit. Who's the they? The they is the allobroges. So the suos refers to the allobroges because they're the subjects here. They're the subjects of the verb paterintur. So that's one connection you can make to know what suos means. Once you know who paterintur is referring to, that allows you to connect suos to it. When it gets confusing is when you have multiple clauses and it switches around. One clause is talking about one party, and then in the next clause, the subject switches to someone else, but it's not explicitly stated, and then they use suos, and you're not sure who suos is referring to. And that's kind of what's happening here. So you really have to put on your thinking cap and pay attention to exactly who these various words like suos and eos are referring to. So let's read the entire sentence starting from allobrogibus, okay? They were thinking, meaning the Helvetii, that they would either persuade the allobroges because they seemed not yet of a good disposition toward the Roman people, or that they would compel them by force, that they permit them to go through their territory. So that's a very literal wooden translation. We can clean it up a little bit. When we say ut paterintur, we can translate that into English by saying they would compel them by force to allow or to permit. So that's a little bit smoother English. And in the translation, in the answer key, I'm going to add in a few of these subjects and direct objects in parentheses so you can help yourself keep track of what's going on. Again, in the second part of the sentence, where it says, well, we coacturos, you have to supply se as the subject accusative, and you have to supply eos as a direct object. You just have to supply those and throw them in yourself. They're understood. So a little bit of work there involved to really get that second part of the sentence flowing smoothly. Continuing on, omnibus rebus ad profectionem comparatis diem dicunt. Let's stop there. We have an ablative absolute here, omnibus rebus, and then comparatis. It means all things having been prepared. Omnibus is ablative plural. Rebus, that's the fifth declension noun res, which means things. Usually we're supposed to translate it in a more specific way other than just things. But here, things actually works pretty well. And then comparatis, that's the verb comparo, which means to prepare. So all things having been prepared, we could maybe translate rebus as arrangements. We could say all arrangements having been made or all arrangements having been prepared. Anything like that works. And then ad here means for the purpose of. And then profectionem is the third declension noun profectio, which means departure. Ad profectionem means for the purpose of their departure. You'll probably notice that profectionem is related to the verb proficiscor. The perfect tense stem of that verb is profectus, so you can see how etymologically it's the same. And then diem dicunt says, they appoint a day. Dicunt is third person plural, present tense. So literally, they say a day in the sense of they appoint a day, or they decree a day. That's what it means. So this sentence so far says, all things having been prepared for the purpose of their departure, they appoint a day. Keep in mind that Julius Caesar is writing with present tense verbs. That's called the historical present. He's using present tense verbs to talk about past events in order to make them seem more vivid. Next, we have a relative clause, qua die ad ripam Rodani omnes conveniant. Qua is the relative pronoun. It's feminine and singular because its antecedent diem is feminine and singular, but it's ablative because it's an ablative of time when in the relative clause. So qua die will mean upon which day. So it's telling you on what day something will happen. So in that sense, it's an ablative of time when. We have a subjunctive verb here that's conveniant. Convenio means to come together or gather or assemble. And here it's present tense, third person plural, but subjunctive. The subject here is omnes. That means all in the sense of all people or everyone. So omnes and conveniant together will say all people come together, or everyone gathers, or everyone assembles. Ad ripam Rodani says at the bank of the Rhone River. So before we translate the whole sentence, we need to figure out why conveniant here is subjunctive. It wasn't completely clear to me, so I looked in Hans Friedrich Müller's commentary on Caesar's Gallic Wars, which I highly recommend, by the way. It's a good book. And he says that this is a relative clause of purpose. So somehow we need to translate the part about everyone assembling, omnes conveniant. We need to translate that in such a way that it expresses that that's what the purpose was in appointing the day. They're appointing the day for that purpose of everybody gathering. So putting it all together, let's translate it like this. All things having been prepared for their departure, they appoint a day so that, so I'm throwing in the word so that here to express the purpose part of it. They appoint a day so that on that day they might all assemble at the bank of the Rhone. Not the best translation ever, kind of clunky, but it does reflect accurately what the Latin is saying. Moving on to the last sentence, it will tell us about the date this happened, and so we have lots of abbreviations here. Let's start out with is dies. Is dies says this day. By the way, notice that we're back to treating dies as masculine here. On line 5, we apparently are treating diem as feminine because qua is feminine. But here we have dies as masculine because it's not being paired with the feminine form of isea id, which would be ea. It's not saying ea dies. It's being given is. So it's is dies with a masculine form of isea id. So it's interesting to see how dies can be either feminine or masculine. Apparently it was feminine when it was being appointed as a special day, but when you're just talking about a day as just a day in general, then it's masculine. That's apparently what's going on here. So is dies erat, that part of the sentence says, this day was. And then he's going to tell us in Latin the calendar dates. We have some helpful footnotes here that talk about Roman dates. Especially in footnote 7, it says, the Romans did not number the days of the month as we do, but called the first day the calends. That's where we get our English word calendar. The 5th day of the month was called the nones. In some months, it was actually the 7th of the month. And the 13th day of the month was called the idus. In some months, it was actually the 15th day of the month. So to express a date In Latin, you could say it's before the calends, before the noni, before the idus. So you have the calends, you have the noni, and you have the idus. These three sort of signposts within each month. And that's what helps you reckon individual days or dates. One other good footnote is footnote 8. It says, the Roman year was designated by the names of the consuls for that year. So instead of calling a year by a number like 1960, 1990, 2010, instead of that, they call it by the name of the people who were consul that year. So we have this abbreviation here, ADV, KAL, APR. So the A and the D stand for ante diem. On page 179, they have a good note about the idiomatic speech here. And this doesn't really need to concern us that much. The idea is it's telling us that it's 5 days before the calends of April. Again, the calends of April would be April 1st. No foolin'. Another thing to keep in mind is that the Romans counted things with inclusive counting. You know, if you're playing a board game and you want to move your piece ahead 5 spaces, you don't count the space that the game piece is sitting on. You don't count that first one as 1 and then move it forward and say 2. No, you take the game piece and move it forward 1 notch and then you count to 1. But that's not how the Romans did it. The Romans did something called inclusive counting, in which they actually would count that space that the piece is on. They would count that as 1. And so when you move it forward 1 notch to an ancient Roman, that would be number 2. So their counting was 1 number off from the way we would count something today. So if you have April 1st as the calends and you count 5 days before that, so the A and the D is ante diem, and then the V is the number 5. That's a Roman numeral that means 5. So basically what it means is 5 days before the calends of April. So if we count that inclusively, counting April 1st as the first day of counting to 5, then that means April 1st is day 1, March 31st would be day 2, March 30th would be day 3, March 29th would be day 4, and March 28th would be day 5. And so by that kind of reckoning, with that inclusive counting, that would give us a date of March 28th. So where it says, is dies erat, this day was, then that next part says basically March 28th, 5 days before the calends of April. And you can read all the footnotes there if you want to go into further detail about this. But in a nutshell, it's 5 days before the calends of April, counted inclusively, resulting in a date of March 28th. Finally, in the last part of the sentence, we have an ablative absolute talking about who was consul during that year. And so that's how we know what year this is. This is 58 BC. In the previous year, 59 BC, Julius Caesar had been consul for that year. So now he's in the first year of his new assignment as proconsul of Gaul. Well, at least the Roman portion of Gaul, the southern part known as Provincia or Gallia Narbonensis. Of course, Julius Caesar ends up going far beyond just that part of Gaul. He's got very imperialistic goals in mind. So he ends up fighting all the way up to the Belgic tribes. In fact, he goes so far beyond the borders of his territory, he goes all the way to the Atlantic on the upper west coast of France near what today would be Brittany, and all the way up to Belgium. So he's just going wildly beyond the borders of the Roman province. His goal really is to add the entire area of Gaul to the Roman state, basically just to annex the whole thing. You know, every year there are 2 consuls. And so in that previous year, 59 BC, when Julius Caesar was consul, he shared the consulship with another guy named Bibulus. But Bibulus was completely overshadowed by Julius Caesar and his big ego. As you can see here, you designate a year with the names of the two people who were consul in that given year. So for 59 BC, the Romans had a joke. They would joke around and say that it was during the consulship of Julius and Caesar, because he took all the power for himself and really just kind of excluded Bibulus. Even though Bibulus was a consul, he really was just a consul in name only, overshadowed completely by Caesar. Bibulus was not in the club. He was not part of Caesar's inner circle of power. And in fact, he was actually Caesar's political opponent. But anyway, back to this reading, what we have is an ablative absolute telling us who was consul and therefore what year it was. So we have the name Lucius Piso, but in the ablative singular, and we have Aulus Gabinius, but in the ablative singular, and then consulibus is the word consul, but that's ablative plural because it's referring to two consuls. So the whole thing is an ablative absolute, meaning with Lucius Piso and Aulus Gabinius as consuls. Or if you wanted to unpack that a little bit, you could say, in the year in which Lucius Piso and Aulus Gabinius were consuls. Or better yet, you could say, during the consulship of Lucius Piso and Aulus Gabinius. But of course, that's not literal. That's just a smooth English rendering. Okay, that brings us to the end of yet another installment of Lenny's Latin class. We had a lot of material this time. Thanks for sticking with me, and we'll see you again next time in Lesson 60.